I think it's basically one question that we get started here with. You know, let's talk quickly about why this session isn't called 4K and HDR, and what are the advantages, at least for the time being, embracing 1080p versus 4K on the resolution side. And let me throw it out to you guys.
Scale.
That's easy.
Next. No. But, you know, it really comes down to the ability to grow the show to our current standards on a regular broadcast. And there's a little bit limiting, and a lot of that is, you know, starting to transition as bandwidth becomes available, you know, IP's helping that cause. But right now, you know, we effectively, you know, to deploy the 24 4K HDR cameras we do every year at Augusta, it's essentially doing over 100 camera, you know, show workflow-wise. So it creates a lot of challenges. So, you know, the 1080p, as we all know, is more viable in our existing infrastructure. But it's all growing and changing.
Brad?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the goal here is that, you know, we're trying to get to HDR as fast as possible. And like Mike said, you know, when you're talking about scale, it's tough to do that when you're talking 2160p and moving that forward. So that's the goal, is that you look at it per show and decide what you can do and what you can get away with. And, you know, look, the goal that we want to be at is as full up as we can be. And if that means, you know, doing it at 1080p HDR, then that's what we'll do. But the more so that we can, you know, in a smaller show and 10 cameras or so, college basketball, college football, things like that, you know, we're going to go as high as resolution as we can get in HDR.
You want to go?
Yeah, sure. For us, it was really cost. So our CTO was spearheading this project. We did a lot of side-by-side testing with 4K and 1080p HDR. You know, if you said the monitor on the left is going to cost you, you know, $1 million, the monitor on the right is going to cost you $15 million. You know, is there that much of a difference between the two? And what we found is within 10 feet away from the monitor, the human eye can only resolve so much resolution. So 1080p seemed like a more viable solution for what we're currently doing as an industry. The replay problem still exists, and until that's solved, 4K native productions on the scale that we do is not likely. So.
Okay. Hey, Rob, why don't you take us through, on the HDR side, and we have a slide that kind of takes us through the terms and stuff, if we can.
Sure. Just so this wasn't a branding session, these are all from SMPTE and ITU documents, and just a very simple overview of HDR terminology and some of the workflows. So you're going to hear 5 major terms bandied about quite often, and the main one, and where it concerns my cameras, is the optoelectronic transfer. And that's basically being able to take in all of the light that hits the sensor, be able to modulate that over the highest dynamic range possible, and then be able to share those signals with other parts of the truck or the production process. So it's optical to electronics. On the other side of that, we're going to take that from electronics back to optical. So it's the transfers functions, which transfers the video that we've conditioned with the HDR signals back into linear light for output at the monitor. OOTF, a little harder to understand, but this is the optical to optical transfer function. So this is where the artistic consideration comes into play. HD had a more defined overall 709 color palette, where HDR has an extremely huge color volume. So to take advantage of this really comes down to the individual behind the controls of the camera to be able to paint and be able to get the maximum out of it, really, for audience appreciation, and some of the conversions that we need to do. HLG, or hybrid log gamma, is a scene referred transfer curve. It does not require static metadata to control screen brightness. So this is why HLG is being used in a lot of the live applications. And it also allows the use of a standard definition monitor in a lot of places where true HDR isn't required. And PQ is a display referred curve, or EOTF. And it's been designed more around the needs of the post-production industry and packaged media. So again, this idea that HLG has been designed to really have a straightforward migration. Part of the issue in 3D, for example, was being able to get all of these signals and all the operators together to be able to present a valid 3D production. Basically, what we can do with HDR through HLG is put this production on top of what we're already doing and having some skilled operators and working out a lot of technical issues to be able to do one production from one truck is the ultimate goal, and HLG will help facilitate that. Just quickly, the curves would allow, again, optics to electronics and electronics back to optics. And you have to have one curve for transport and the inverse of that curve to be able to show the light in the way it was intended. So very, very basic workflow. In the cinema or file-based, basically the camera captures everything to a raw negative. That is taken into technical grading and put into ACES Academy color space, and technical grading will happen to a very, very specific monitor like our X300. Once it's referenced to that, there'll be some creative intent put into it, and then you would do an HDR finish and an SDR finish before you go to a mastering stage and then distribution. Live is a little bit more complicated. So you've got many, many sources coming into a truck. You've got the cameras of the day, you've got the footage from other shows or highlight reels coming in, bumpers and commercials and graphics and all different modes of signals that all have to end up being the same flavor to go through the production process. So we need to condition those signals so whatever doesn't come into the truck HDR needs to be made into HDR. So there's layers and layers of conversions, and then you have to have an HDR stream and an SDR stream within the truck. So I've completely oversimplified what these gentlemen are going to talk to for the rest of the panel. What I do want to emphasize here is that the HDR that we use for production is different than the HDR that we use for distribution. So the distribution HDR is going to count on what the cable head end is requiring or whatever type of transport and whoever the end customer is going to be. They will choose a PQ or HLV or HDR10, etc. And we still have to respect the money-making portion of the show, which is the Rec 79 SDR production. And then it gets into your consumer set, and your set will detect whether it's HLG or it's PQ and add curves, appropriate curves for the display. So very, very oversimplified look at what HDR is.
All right, anybody have any questions? Okay.
Easy
Sorry.
peasy.
My head still hurts. Let's talk about a little bit of all you guys. Craig, start with you. Discuss your most recent projects in HDR and how it went and stuff like that.
So we were approached to do Notre Dame football this season in 1080p HDR. Essentially, we did what was just mentioned. We were producing 2 streams within the truck. We wanted to do it out of a single stream. We felt that the side-by-side method is not viable long-term from a cost basis. So out of the truck, we produced 2 feeds. One was a 1080i in 5.1 SDR show, and the second feed was 1080p HDR in 5.1.4. We learned a lot. We worked with our partners at NEP, Sony, Cobalt, EBS, SMT, everybody, all the vendors were involved. There was a lot of learning on the job, so to speak. One of the mandates that we had was to your point earlier, do no harm to the 709, which is 99.9% of the eyeballs that see what we're doing. So we needed to come up with a way that when we produced the show in 1080p HDR, which is what the truck was set to do, we were able to shade everything in the 1080i SDR so that what was being QC'd by the shaders was what was going on the air. So that took a little bit of work. We got through that. We struggled a lot, not struggled, but we spent a lot of time getting graphics from SDR 8-bit up to 10-bit into the switcher, and then we had to get them back down to SDR. So that round trip process took a lot of learning. All these things that we did not anticipate going into the project, we came out with, with a laundry list of things learned and things that we still need to do yet.
Brad, want to take us through?
Yeah, I mean, the nice part about where we kind of started from early on was that, we've been doing a lot of 4K productions in the past, so we've gotten some things kind of down on that workflow standpoint of 1080p replay integrated into a 4K show. So when you started layering in HDR onto the SDR that existed, we had the building blocks there. We'd played with enough stuff and we had tested enough over time to make that kind of a more seamless process. The challenge was when we were asked to kind of fully launch it live, it was for the US Open and it was for some of our feature group coverage as part of what DirecTV does with us. And so that included RF handhelds and things like that were kind of brand new to the scene at that point. So there was a lot of work in getting those things working and finding cameras that work to actually transmit out that the camera operators would like to use, along with getting that signal back, controlling it with that kind of technology that's out there. So there were a lot of steps in that process that were simplified because we'd done pieces of them before, and some of the workflows existed and that were clean. But you talk about replay, which is kind of the kind of one of the two big sticking points. First one's graphics, the second one's is replay. And that replay functions, still the minute you go to 10-bit and you go to HDR, you start increasing your bandwidth on the machines, and all these great workflows that we've spent a lot of time developing on a 1 gig circuit to file transfer back to do things now all of a sudden are completely broken. So it's a lot of that work that goes back into rethinking through things, deciding which codec you're going to use because you've used something for the last 8 years or so, and now you've decided that guess what, that doesn't work anymore. From that side. So there's a lot of that goes forward into what we're doing to try and figure those things out. So, you're still, stuck at the question of, do you do a couple of replays that really matter in true 2160p HDR, and the rest of them are in 1080p HDR? How do you slice that back and forth into your show to maximize what we're going for, which is quality in the end, and and beautiful images for people to watch at home. So that's kind of those are the stepping stones that, every 6 months we hear what, Craig and NBC is doing or what Mike and CBS is doing, and we find out that, the one little problem or issue that we had has been solved. And it's that kind of stepping stone that it's great that we can all kind of work together to find these solutions as we go forward.
Yeah, I mean, for us, our most recent project was the PGA Championship last year in St. Louis. We did a 3-hole feature hole coverage for our partners at AT&T DirecTV, and it was basically the most complete, I think, HDR telecast we've done to date. We, we're into the details, and all the stuff Craig pointed out is a very, stuff that kind of catches you by surprise at first. It's the graphics workflows, the file-based workflows, as Brad mentioned, and the way to go to and from SDR when you're not talking real time is a very manual process. It takes a lot of testing and trial and error. So we've been moving down this road for about 3 years now, and the last few events we did in HDR are actually televised to the home that way. So it's been good to see kind of all the pieces come together. At this point, the camera side, the acquisition side, it's almost the easy part. There's some really talented video operators and engineers who have to really get into the settings and optimize those pictures. But it's everything that surrounds it to get you to that full level of production you're used to in SDR, and let our production people feel like they're not sacrificing bells and whistles that they are accustomed to using on these shows. So it's still evolving. I don't want to say it's getting easier. We're just, I think, getting better at it. And ideally, when it's a single format world, it will be easier. It'll hopefully be more like we're dealing with an SDR HD show. So it's been a fun process to be a part of, and as our colleagues up here know, we talk, we help each other out, and we communicate on what's what you can stub your toe on when doing these things.
Thanks. Rob, if I can ask you to just talk a little bit about what does the industry need to do to kind of make this more easy to adapt, and partners like you at Sony, what is it that you think, big picture right now, that we're kind of going down this road? What is it that needs to get done, or how has it become easier, is I guess the question?
Well, we have to do more of what we're doing now. So we try to be part of every telecast if we can, and take that feedback back to our engineering group in Japan and make sure that we have a clear understanding between the local sales company, the end user broadcaster production company, and what's going on in Japan. You know, that is really a fundamental deal. We've been able to quickly turn around software that makes operation a little bit easier or more straightforward. We've introduced some converters that initially were very, very difficult to use. Try to get new GUIs for them so they're not an all-day install. We've tried to take our high-end Supermotion equipment and ensure that becomes easier to use and easier to integrate within the truck, because that gives you that 4K HDR 4 times, 8 times overall. We're on our second generation of HDR cameras. So the first cameras were the 4300s 4K, purpose-built for 4K, but it was our first opportunity to be able to take all of the new technologies and put it into a new chassis. Our last generation of HD cameras basically were the same cameras with 60p capability and a more sensitive imager. The 4300 allowed us a clean slate. And the nice thing about that camera was it still operates very well in a 1080 60p environment, so it provides the HDR signals. We introduced some HDR components for our previous generation cameras because there's scads of them out there, and we don't want to be, we don't want to leave our customers behind who have joined us on the journey. The difficulty was those cameras were never really designed with HDR in mind. So what we put on them were a way to get more color out of them, a way to get a little bit more dynamic range, because all of this stuff was built for 709 and 600% video. So once we went beyond that, it becomes a push me, pull you type of relationship, either a little bit more noise or lower resolution, or again, they weren't built. We introduced just now our second generation, which will be HDR 1080 60p cameras with a new high dynamic range CMOS in it, and very simple CCU that will be able to get HDR and SDR at the same time, and it's much less money from a capital standpoint than our last generation. So we're trying to, as we go through this journey, is make things a little bit more cost effective, a little easier to use, and then incorporating the feedback from the great work that you guys are doing in the field. We do work with other partners. We do share a lot of the knowledge that we've gained, and we want this to work. We were talking before on if you had the ability to capture Muhammad Ali in 4K HDR and be able to watch that today, and the difference in that experience between that and black and white Madison Square Gardens with zero contrast, it's a different world, and we have a responsibility really to capture history and preserve it. So we look forward to doing that with you.
Great, thank you. Craig, if I can, kind of the last question, get your guys' opinion on, so if someone hasn't done an HDR show, so how do they make the leap? What should they expect? Do they need is Sony as a partner? Where do you guys come out on that? What kind of advice can you offer?
The first thing I would say is to engage the vendors. I mean, to Rob's point, this is critical, from the vendor side. What would make HDR easier for the workflows that we're used to doing up here. One of the things that doesn't exist right now is there's no file header or metadata on any of the SDI or the file headers. So if Mike or Brad do a show in HDR and it's coming to me with a negative offset gain of X, there's got to be something in that signal that tells me, hey, this is how you get back to SDR. Same with the file-based workflow. All that sort of stuff is, unless you're there and you're doing it yourself and writing it down on a napkin and handing it off, we're just sort of doing our own separate islands of production here. So I guess my first advice would be to engage the vendor. You can't do any of this without vendor support. And then also push the vendor. So if there are any vendors out here, I would say let's try to get together on metadata and solve that issue so that this could really build up some head steam.
Yeah, I mean, I think, going off of what Craig said, this, the second piece is there are certain things that you have right now in your facility that you can test. Get a monitor, test it doesn't need to be the nicest monitor out there. You can see a lot by buying a very high-end Sony television.
Oh, thank you.
And you know, and some converters from any number of your favorite converter purchasing places, and you know, get something that does some conversion. Play with it. See what it looks like. See what your graphics look like coming out of it, because those are static constants of your production that exist right now that you can start to look at and say, hey, how would this look like in HDR? What would happen if I did this? You know, and the same thing goes for, at that point, once you've done that, you can look at what an edit looks like and start making those choices in the background of, do I really need to edit in HDR? Can I just edit in SDR and pump it out? What's the color grading going to look like? What's going to happen? What are the colors going to be able to do to the image to make it look better when it does air there? So there are a lot of those kind of intermediate steps that you can do in your own facility, in a truck, on an off day, on a regular production day, a set day, to figure these things out and start to really kind of play with them and understand what's happening and what's going on. Because you will find that there are all these little pieces, and all, you know, the cameras, like, you know, Mike said, are kind of the simple part at this point. It's really kind of the rest of it that's out there of things that you need to check on, that you need to do. And you know, it's even the little things when you get to a show of, like, you have to convert the clock camera to HDR to put it into the bug box as the backup when the clock system goes down. So it's that small kind of stuff that you want to really start to develop and look at and figure out, you know, where are the gotchas going to be, so you're not getting gotcha'd on show day.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. On both their points, it's all in the details. You really need to carefully test each workflow in the truck, from graphics to replay, to, you know, the switching and everything in between. And it's not just the one-way conversion you have to be concerned about. Yes, you want to make as credible as possible HDR out of SDR, but more importantly, you need to make sure it goes back to SDR properly, based on our distribution needs right now. And, you know, what we've worked towards with a lot of testing is we stay in an HDR world and we convert at the end, instead of living in the hybrid, you know, SDR, HDR simultaneously. We are deriving our SDR from our HDR, and that took a lot of R&D from some much smarter people than me in our labs, and you know, I think that's really what makes it a viable workflow, to where, you know, I think the next step would be, let's start producing our shows that way, whether it's going to go anywhere in HDR or not. That, I think, is a key piece to the transition that, you know, we all hope to achieve here in the, you know, coming years. So you know, but you really can't ignore any piece of the puzzle. Every detail needs to be thought all the way through. Stuff you've definitely taken for granted in the last, you know, decade of making TV. You really have to, you know, account for everything.
Great. Any other things you want to add?
I just would like to touch on replays. To your point, we wanted to stay in HDR the whole way, but we also had to sacrifice for production some of the, you know, functionality that they're used to coming out of servers. So, you know, we didn't find that there was a small enough codec that gave us the picture quality that we were used to. We ran in, you know, a very large file size. It reduced channels on the EVS. It reduced functionality coming out of the 4300s. All these things need to be solved. Otherwise, we're, like Brad said, we're just in a state of workarounds, which were, you know, it's kind of fun to figure out, but long term, all these things need to be solved in order to make HDR viable for broadcast. So.
Kenny?
Here we go. Let's go fantasy world. So let's say next year Rob calls up and says, guess what, Sony's all in, we want to launch NFL coverage every game in 1080p HDR, let's make it happen. So what?
My address is 10201 West. No.
So if that happened, again, it's not going to happen, but if it did, are we there yet? I mean, what could it be done? Could you do every NFL game in HDR even if you wanted to?
I think there's a very few at this point, problems to solve, mainly around our super slow motion workflow, the available you know, channels on the replay servers, but all of that, you know, in theory, 1080p is going to help all of that if we were to go that format over 2160p. So it's a I think that's kind of the last horizon. What we've found, at least as a temporary solution on the graphics front, is we're doing real-time conversion in play, right in line. So we haven't had to change our graphics build yet. That said, we want to get there, but we also need to wait for the hardware to catch up on that front. So I think with a little bit of sacrifice, it could be done, yes.
With the right checkbook, anything is possible.
It's definitely easier for NBC to say we're ready to do it because we just have the one show a week. So I don't know about these guys, but we could do it.
All right, any questions from anyone? Anybody have anything? No?
You
All right.
said a fantasy broadcast, so we're going to shoot 8K 120p at the Sony Open as an experiment in 4K. So it's 16 times the resolution of what we're talking about here, and it's already started. Not that we're going 8K and we're not, right. We're experimenting for us.
Well, that's actually, you mentioned the 120. Would you guys rather have 1080p HDR at 120 frames per second as a production format versus 4K HDR at 60?
Yes, if we had the production tools to support it. Right now we can't do much at all with 120 frame content, but yeah, we all could see the benefit in it.
Okay.
Go.
Yeah, one thing we noticed in our testing was we looked at 4K coming to us at, I think it was 13 megs, and then we looked at 1080p down around 5, and the 1080p looked better. I think for content distribution, 1080p is the way we will move, certainly. It's my
And I think it's a stopgap, frankly, but it's one we could get to rather quickly. As IP progresses and we're switching at 40 gigs instead of 10 gigs. Why, as to Brad's earlier point, why not do more and better pixels if you can? Right now, it's just a sacrifice, which we don't really feel is a big sacrifice in 1080p HDR, but it allows us, like I said, to grow the show.
And the consumer sets are so good, and they have built-in up converters, and you've got a quarter of it solved already. You've got the color palette, and to any viewer, this is going to be a wow moment seeing it. So the 4K can only get better. And
Great.
So-
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Great job, guys. Oh, hold on, a question. Sorry, we have one.
Regarding HDR transfer function, so you've got the backward compatibility to SDR with those, but in the PQ, there are open and proprietary there, but it's only HDR, right? And then you got Dolby Vision, and the metadata plays into that. So are you guys looking downstream to the viewer and the monitors downstream? Because it sounds like for the time being, you're just doing SDR and HDR.
So our approach so far in the last couple of years has been HLG because of the benefits from live acquisition and what we've coined as camera to consumer, in the same format. Essentially, we don't have to worry about converting at multiple places. So that's been our strategy so far.
Yeah, but that goes back to the previous point of if I'm in HLG and Brad's handing me S-Log and you're handing me PQ, something needs to auto detect that and adjust for that. Right now, unless I'm on the phone with you and I say, hey, what is this? I don't know what you're handing me. So yeah, we can get from one to the other. It's a sort of a laborious process right now.
Yeah, it's a lot of manual labor right now to move from those formats. Obviously, we're all producing in HLG on the road and sending it back, and then from there, we have 5 different distributors who are picking us up, and some of them convert it to HDR10, some of them do PQ. It all kind of depends where you're at, and so that's kind of been a testing workflow, and that's probably the biggest challenge that's out there is making sure you're lining that up correctly, especially for the distributors who are putting this out, because they're not just the cable and satellite providers we're used to. There's a lot of OTTs picking all of us up now to do these kind of things, and they're providing this to the home based upon you know, Roku and Apple TV and all those different boxes that can handle this stuff. So it's very interesting to see kind of as it progresses and to go between the different boxes and seeing what happens to the same original signal you've made.
All right,
Thank you, gentlemen.
thank you.